All right, so we're going to start delving into different parts of Unit 2, Area Study 1 Bio. And today we're going to talk about the first kind of reproduction, the type of reproduction that actually most organisms on Earth did for most of the life of organisms on Earth, which I think is pretty interesting. And that's asexual reproduction. And if you read Cyanide and Happiness, this little comic is quite funny. It says, "Check it out, I'm the first person ever to clone myself." And the other guy says, "That's amazing, I bet you're pretty excited." And the guy says, "I'm beside myself." So he did that just to make that joke, didn't he? Just $12 billion, best $12 billion I ever spent. Hilarious. Pause the video here, have a go at the 3 quick questions. We'll go through these together in class. Alright, so in Area Study 1 of Unit 2, we're talking about asexual reproduction, obviously, and we want to talk about different types of asexual reproduction, such as fission, budding, what we call vegetative propagation, and spore formation. Spore formation is going to be really important for one of the major assessment tasks you'll be doing next week, but also vegetative propagation is something that you've done in your pracs yesterday with tubers. All right, and then also what's really most important about talking about asexual reproduction is the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. So what is asexual reproduction? Let's break down the word, okay? Often in biological terms actually means not. So asexual simply means not sexual. Okay, so this is reproduction where we get a single parent, like this little pink pony, and this single parent, through this process, produces a genetically identical group of cells, or a whole genetically identical organism. Okay, in prokaryotes, we call this binary fission. So bacteria, they do that binary fission process we talked about last time, and in eukaryotes, we call this mitosis, which is 2 processes we've already talked about. Let's have a look at a good example of asexual reproduction. So you can see in this example here, it's showing us this research from this scientist called John Bonner, and he studied what we call slime molds, which is actually a type of fungus, for about 70 years, and they're really cool, they're really great to look at, really easy to access as well. They're pretty much just a little bag that's just in a slime mesh. But they're really cool because all of this movement that they're doing, all of their action really is just through the process of mitosis. So a pretty cool example, asexual reproduction in action, slime molds. In asexual reproduction, pretty much what is produced, this is really important, you get offspring, which offspring are the result of a mating or a result of some kind of reproduction that are genetically identical to the parent cell. So in many ways, asexual reproduction is all about producing clones, okay? So let's talk about some advantages of asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is really, really fast, okay? There's no need for the courtship that happens in sexual reproduction. There's no need to produce gametes, which are the sex cells, okay? And for being fast, it requires low energy, okay? All members of a species in asexual reproduction can reproduce. For example, in bacteria, there's no such thing males and females. Humans, for example, myself as a male, I can't reproduce, okay? And there's no need for things like vectors. And plants often need vectors, and also different insects often also need vectors. So pretty much when is asexual reproduction handy is after a really big decline in a population, or if we get a new habitat becoming available, asexual reproduction is great because it's going to generate a massive new population really, really fast with very little effort. And so successfully, genetics can be reproduced repeatedly, okay? So we're going to kind of constant repetition of pretty much the same ideal organism. But when's it bad? Okay, when's asexual reproduction bad? There's only really one answer for this, and it's actually an extremely important answer. It's because the lack of genetic variability is a huge problem in an unstable or changing environment. Okay, so pretty much what this means is that in the case where the environment is okay and the organism is just living off its life just fine, asexual reproduction is great. But if the environment has a massive change, it's likely that asexually reproducing organisms might not be able to be genetically might have enough genetic variation to survive that change. Okay? So the question is, why not do both? Why don't we just turn around? Every now and again we reproduce sexually, every now and again asexually. Some species do, okay? Some species do reproduce both asexually and sexually. A really great example of this are these guys, the fungi, okay? But also some insects, some plants, some crustaceans, some algae, some different reptiles and stuff also. You actually find examples of organisms that can reproduce both sexually and asexually throughout the living world, okay? But for sure, fungi are probably one of the best examples, okay? And this is just sort of an example of a diagram of an organism which can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So, for example, if we have a bad environment, an organism might decide to reproduce sexually, and that's simply because through the sexual reproduction of this organism, we're going to get more genetic variation. And then let's say the environment stabilizes a little bit and we get more ideal growth conditions, then that organism might decide to, hey, I'm going to reproduce asexually, okay, and get my population really nice and big. Just a little break comic in the middle of the lesson today. So here we have a starfish, which is a great example of a type of organism that can reproduce both sexually and asexually, but here it's decided to reproduce asexually. I'm really struggling. And then the crab says, "Congratulations on a little bundle of joy." And both of the starfish, they're sort of greasing each other off. Whose baby is it? Or who is the baby? Yeah, it's a bit weird. Now let's talk about a few different types of asexual reproduction. We're not going to talk about binary fission very much again. We talked about this last time. But we're going to talk about asexual reproduction, mainly splitting, spore formation. We have natural cloning, we call in animals, such as budding of animals. That's really common in jellyfish. And then we can also have things like puffs, which happens in some reptiles, for example. And then we have vegetative propagation in different plants. We can have cuttings. That's us as humans. We do cuttings. Strawberries love a bit of runners. We have rhizomes. We have suckers. This actually, especially if you make a massive list. Massive list. You don't have to know all of them. Just have to know a few specific examples, really. The simplest form of asexual reproduction in eukaryotes is called self-splitting, okay, and this is pretty much mitosis, okay? It's the same mitosis that you learnt about in the cell cycle, all right, and pretty much you just have one cell, and that cell decides one day it goes through the cell cycle, and through the cell cycle it does mitosis, and you get two genetically identical cells. Some multicellular organisms, such as flatworms, anemones, coral, all do the cell splitting as well, and it's a really cool process because obviously lots and lots of groups of cells have decided to do mitosis at the same time in a very specific form. Let's watch some anemone cell splitting really. This is a time lapse. Here we have, so it was one individual. And from the one individual, we're going to get two individuals, right? So that was cell splitting in anemone. It wasn't the best quality, sorry. If you click on the video itself on the PowerPoint, you can actually open that yourself and have a better watch. And there's obviously lots and lots of different examples of this in the internet. And they're often really cool to look at, especially when they do little time-lapse videos like this one. We also have things like budding in eukaryotes, and pretty much this is a hydra, which is a different type of sea eukaryote. And pretty much what a hydra does is a small piece of the hydra actually buds off, and it will land on the seafloor somewhere, and we're going to get a whole new hydra out of here, okay? If you click here, this is a little video on that, pretty much just explaining the process to a bit more of a degree. What's really important here, obviously, is that this hydra and this hydra are genetically identical. Yeah. All right, parthenogenesis. This is a really cool process. Like I said, reptiles often do parthenogenesis, and this is where an unfertilized egg becomes an offspring. Okay, so the ladies in this sense, they're cutting out the guys, and it's. You probably say a lot of ladies would say that this is quite handy. You see this in things like aphids, some other insects, variety of lizards such as the Australian prickly gecko. Okay, it can be. There's two different kinds of parthenogenesis. We have obligate or obligatory parthenogenesis. This means that it always occurs. The organism can't decide not to. All right, or you can have facultative parthenogenesis, which it means that it just simply occurs sometimes. Okay, for example, if there aren't very many males around. Okay, I've put those two words not because you have to know them about and specifically parthenogenesis, but often in biology, these two terms are used when something is either has to always happen, so obligate, or sometimes only happens, so by choice, or whether it is in only certain circumstances, so facultative. And then we have, so that's animals, and in plants, asexual reproduction, pretty much, it falls under this umbrella that we call vegetative propagation. And this can be things like cuttings, which are made by humans. I'm going to go and prune the vines, and from those vines, we can actually produce some cuttings. We might actually have a crack at doing that this year. Remind me. We can have things like runners strawberries are really famous for doing runners. Hopefully the strawberries at the back of the classroom start growing a bit more and potentially make some runners soon. And they're pretty much just stems that plant themselves on some good soil nearby. And from planting themselves on that good soil, a brand new clone of that original plant is going to grow from that. And then there's obviously things like you guys have looked already, tubers, which appear on potatoes like this, and you're just going to get a brand new organism that's genetically identical to the original still. And then lastly, we've got spore formation in fungi. I've given you lots of detail here, pretty much saying how spores in fungi are produced through mitosis, all right, and then produce offsprings that are genetically identical to the parent, okay? The fungal spores are going to just simply rest on a good surface, whether it's like your bread, okay? And then you're going to get new fungal, what we call mycela, all right? And these new mycela can go and produce new spores, okay? And I've given you lots of information here because of our little study that we're going to do on sexual and asexual reproduction in fungi.